Welcome to an introduction to Chapter 7 of United States History. Now, during this lesson, the main task for you is to try to come up with a timeline of events across the chapter. The temptation would be to try to write every little thing down. That will be almost impossible. It would take you a very long time to make that timeline. You've got to try and pick out key events, and hopefully it'll trigger some memories from GCSE because there's some commonality here, some of the things that you've seen before. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Chapter 7 though, to set you on your way whilst help you with your coursework. First thing of note is that the United States foreign policy had now irrevocably changed, and it hasn't changed back since. Traditionally, from the 1860s when you started this course, America's at least spoken about isolationism, like it was a goal of theirs to only involve themselves in foreign policy if it concerned the American continent. Of course, they fell away from this at certain points. But the lesson that they took from the Second World War is America's lack of involvement in world politics and diplomacy before the Second World War meant that there was the rise of militarism in Japan and Germany. So a rather arrogant view was sort of developing that because America didn't get involved, the Second World War happened. If America had got involved, it would have been able to have been stopped. And so since that point, America has had the sort of idea that America has to get involved as sort of the world policeman to a more interventionist foreign policy. And it wasn't like the Second World War ended and then they went about their own business. There wasn't much of a gap between the Second World War and, there wasn't any gap really, confrontations beginning with Russia, or the Soviet Union I should rather say. And the Cold War started to be a preoccupation of America, making sure that capitalism was seen to be the best, stopping the spread of communism around the world. There was real fear, especially after China fell to communism in 1949. There was a common criticism of politicians in America around 1949, saying that they had lost China. Now, again, that's a bit arrogant because America didn't have China to begin with, but the suggestion was that if America had taken a bit more involvement in Chinese affairs, they may well have been able to stop the communists winning the Chinese Civil War and taking over China. So that's foreign policy. They had all sorts of confrontations with the Soviet Union in the conferences. We'll do a bit about that. But back domestically, well, just like after the First World War, the Second World War gave America a big kickstart to the economy. We know that the economy had stalled and there'd been a Great Depression. And really the only thing that brought America out of the Great Depression, in terms of the statistics and as in like reducement in unemployment figures, really was the Second World War. And after the war, living standards improved. Again, the car industry, just like after the First World War, was massively influential in that. And the country started to... There was a growth of suburbs, consumerism again, so suburbs, housing estates on the outside of cities because more people had cars, so they could travel into the cities to do their work. Minority groups, or people who were groups that were disadvantaged before, play a key role here. Women. Now, women had gained some influence with the Second and First World Wars, but as many of you correctly recognised in an essay you've done recently, a lot of the gains they made during the wars were subsequently lost after the wars, and that really the Second World War was no different. But in the period from 45 to 60, women started to make some gains towards greater equality to men. And there was a change in attitude. Women were no longer satisfied, by and large, with their lot in life. Oh yes, and there was a new big development of youth culture, which you probably will remember from your GCSEs, doing about youth culture and teenagers. Well, the same thing was happening in America. And there was the growing role of the media was changing perceptions in America that the teenagers were a big problem. Teenagers were probably not as big of a problem as newspapers made out. However, it sold stories to make out that teenagers were out of control. Cinema and television helped to influence that. And people thought that television and cinema was one of the reasons why the teenagers were out of control. So we talked about minorities, we talked about women. Teenagers were a key minority. I mean, women aren't really a minority, they're half the population. But teenagers were a social group that are in focus, if you like. So were African Americans. So there's some big cases with African Americans that helped to gain African Americans closer to equality. Some would argue they're not at equality even now, but the 60s were transformative. This chapter stops at 1960, but the groundwork was laid in the 50s for what would happen in the 1960s for African Americans. Native Americans also gained some more rights, and the destruction of the Native American way of life had sort of stalled in this second half of the textbook because it had kind of been completed just about by the First World War, and there was sort of a reversion to trying to give them something back. Slowly but surely. So there's a bit about Native Americans in the chapter. One of the biggest bits, though, that really influences politics was Mccarthyism. And I'm going to show you. This fella. There he is. It became like a witch hunt. McCarthy said the government was infiltrated and riddled with communists. And it made people terrified that that might actually be true. And people were scared that there were communists everywhere. And he showed some very dodgy proof that what he was saying was right. But he ended up overseeing lots of trials, McCarthy hearings to try to question people, and it became like a witch hunt, like I say. If you were accused of being a communist, that almost sort of was like, right, he's definitely communist. There's no smoke without fire. People lost their jobs, people's political careers were ruined, actors and things also lost their jobs. But it turned out that McCarthy, well, he was exposed and he lost a lot of face, and it was a big downfall. But he had an influence because all American politicians were keen to show that they were hard on communism, because anybody who preached about not being so hard on communism might be accused of being a communist by McCarthy and his followers, and that could mean political ruin. So even though he himself was eventually discredited, it did have a big influence on those who did matter, like the presidents and the rest of the politicians. Who maybe therefore took more forceful action over any communist incident around the world. So yeah, there we go. It's a time where America had gone from being one of the world's most powerful nations before the Second World War to one of only two world superpowers. There was only the Soviet Union and America that could dominate world politics, and they were to do until the 1980s. So it gave a lot America, and also America was now willing to get involved, not just willing, but thought it necessary that they got involved in world politics. I mean, even just yesterday, you might be watching this in future years, but even just yesterday, it was all about Donald Trump declaring that Jerusalem was is going to be the capital, or regarded as the capital of Israel, according to the United States. That is Donald Trump sticking his nose in foreign affairs. Unheard of in the 1920s for Americans to do something like that, but then they're doing it in this period, in this day, maybe as a hangover from this reaction from the Second World War, which was a ridiculously traumatic event for the world. Millions died. Americans were traumatized from it as well, and there was this switch to, we're going to get involved. America would get wealthier, living standards would improve, and McCarthyism would scare people at home. And there you go, there's your bit of an instruction. So you need to look through the textbook, try to make a bit of a timeline of what happened, and also there's Crash Course in US History, the Cold War is worth a look, to try to get your head round the first bit that we're going to do, which is the Cold War. Because it's the first bit in the textbook. There you go.